We have this improv group every year that they did this thing called Bacon Fest, where you could pay a certain amount and just get unlimited bacon, and there were like games and stuff like that. And somebody was giving out hats, and it was from the company MailChimp. So it's a monkey hat that's wearing a hat. And I love it when hats wear hats. So I hope it's okay with you that I wear this holiday hat. If you were thinking about going to Lights at the Lake over the weekend down at Radio Springs Park, I will actually be giving out candy canes on Saturday night. So I'm going to Hanging of the Greens and at the early seating, and then I get to go down to Radio Springs Park and walk off the inevitable food baby that I will have, and kind of walk that off and then hand out candy canes. And I will most likely be wearing this hat because this hat is very super soft and very festive. Are y'all having a good day today? Meh. Are you at least happy to know that there's one more week left? Maybe? Okay, so I got a couple of questions about when the final is, and when I tell people check the syllabus, not everybody knows where to find the syllabus, even though it's been up the entire semester. So I thought I would share it with you. So if you go to our landing page for general psych, you can actually see that the syllabus is right here. And to be fair, normally I would have given you a printed out copy. Okay, I'm taking off the hat. It's too hot. And I'm going to get hat hair. And I'm very vain about my hair. But when you download the syllabus, it looks like quite a few of you have looked at it because it's been downloaded about 80 times. So somebody's been looking at the syllabus, so that's good. But at the very end, the optional final is Monday, December 13th from 10 to 12 o'clock. Now, because I am doing it online, because it is an optional final that is online, you do not have to be here in this classroom. And additionally, if you look on e-learning, I actually have a different time for the final. So if you scroll all the way down, the optional final is not open yet. It is going to open. It is going to open on the 13th at midnight. You will have until noon to take it. So you only get one shot at it. And it opens up at midnight. So you have 12 hours. You don't have to take it at 10 o'clock in the morning. You can choose to take it as you can be up late and take it at 2 o'clock in the morning. You can take it at 8 o'clock in the morning. You could take it at 11 a.m. But as long as you get it done by noon, you're welcome to do that. And it is optional. I will only use this exam if it's better than one of your other grades. So do kind of keep that in mind. For those of you that choose not to take the optional final, remember that I'll take your 4 exams. If you choose to take the final, I will replace one of your grades with the final if it's better than something. So this can't hurt you. It can only help you. So if you missed an exam and you need to take it, be prepared to take this on e-learning on Monday morning. Okay? You don't have to be here in the room to take it. Just a friendly reminder that our 4th exam is next Wednesday. Over the weekend, I'm going to be recording a review session, and I will get that out to you by Monday. So you don't have to show up for anything. I'll just record it for you because it's mostly just me going through the study guide anyway. And then additionally, you have your final quiz that has posted. It is due Monday at 5 o'clock. So make sure that you get all of that in. And also, if you want 5 extra credit points, make sure and politely nudge your classmates. Please do not threaten, because occasionally when I've done this, other people are like, you better do it. Like, don't threaten your classmates, be kind, but politely nudge your classmates and make sure that they get their course evals in, because if 80% does, or higher, the entire class gets 5 extra credit points. And who doesn't want that? And I will bring treats next week. You like those thick frosted cookies? I do too. You can only really have one. How many of you do not like those cookies? Really? But they're sugar. Yeah, but all cookies are just sugar. Okay, fair enough. All right. So the final is on Monday, December 13th. It is online. It will be due at noon. Do not forget. I would obviously, in the interest of time, I only have a few days to report final grades. So if you don't get it in, that's it. Okay, so I'm being serious. I can't push anything back at this point, and I also can't push back exam 4. So if you're not feeling well, you need to get in touch with me like stat. I will find a workaround, but I can't do extensions at this point. Okay. All right. Maybe I will put the hat back on in a minute. I don't know. All right, but today we are going to move on to talk about some more psychological disorders, and you might actually find this next one surprising. Drugs and substance abuse are technically psychological disorders. And some of you might be surprised about that. You may be saying, well, aren't drugs just biological? Aren't they just affecting your physiology? And the truth of the matter is that like everything else that we have talked about in this class, remember, it is based on biological factors, psychological factors, and social cultural factors. So remember that this too is a biopsychosocial phenomenon. There is biology. These drugs will affect your biology. And we do know that there are genetic predispositions to abuse. Addiction runs in both sides of my family. I have members of both sides of my family that really enjoy alcohol, probably a bit too much. And since I was growing up, I was told, you have alcoholism in both sides of your family. And I think that kind of kept me away from it. Additionally, my mother and my sister both kind of struggle with nicotine. So, drugs can be addictive. There are family histories, but there are other things that also come into play. How you respond to stress, whether you are part of a culture that uses drugs as a way to kind of manage that stress. So how many of you have seen on TV, we especially here in the United States really like to do that with alcohol. How many of you have seen it where somebody's having a bad day and they go, oh, I need a drink? Yeah. We have happy hour, y'all. We have happy hour, which encourages people to drink after work or on a Friday to basically help manage the stress that basically piled on during the week. So we have these cultural factors, we have these psychological factors, and we have biological factors. So substance abuse is absolutely something that we need to talk about with respect to mental health. So what is a substance-related disorder or a substance use disorder? We are talking about somebody who is having a maladaptive pattern of substance use. We are not talking about somebody who goes to happy hour like maybe once a week and maybe knocks back 2 drinks. We are talking about somebody who cannot function in their day without drugs. And it is having an impact on their well-being and on their health. And even if it's not necessarily disrupting your work, it is potentially damaging your health. So that's especially true for people that smoke. And folks, if you smoke, I am not judging you. Nicotine addiction is one of the hardest things to kick. So if you're interested in learning more about these things, I actually teach a class in drugs and behavior every fall. And we learn about the different types of drugs and the effects that they have on the brain, your body, and your mood. Nicotine addiction is one of the hardest ones to kick, and here's why. Folks, do you know how long it takes for IV injected heroin to reach your brain? 14 seconds. Do you know how long it takes nicotine to reach your brain? 7. I know, right? That's kind of surprising, but that's what makes nicotine addiction so hard to kick. It reaches the brain in such a short period of time. So we're kind of getting some reinforcement, right? We're getting operant conditioning here. You take a puff of a cigarette, that nicotine hits your brain in 7 seconds. And for somebody who has a substance use disorder with nicotine, they're going to start feeling calm. They're going to start feeling more relaxed. They're going to be able to focus. They're going to feel less agitated. That is really reinforcing, and it makes nicotine addiction very, very hard to kick. But my point is to kind of get back to what I was talking about. Nobody's going to give you a hard time if you go on a smoke break. But odds are pretty good if you are struggling with smoking that you can't go very long without another cigarette, that you crave cigarettes. And when you don't get a cigarette or nicotine at a certain period of time, you will get angry, you will get frustrated, you will get grouchy. And that's obviously not going to be like dysfunctional and disruptive to your daily life the way that alcohol abuse is, or the way that opioid abuse is. But remember too, cigarette smoking is really bad for your health. You know, I can't sit there and be like, cigarette smoking is good for you. I'm not going to say that, but I also know how hard it is to kick for sure. So we're going to get clinically significant impairments and distress, if not for yourself, then for somebody else. So it is a maladaptive pattern of use that could lead to financial troubles, that could lead to legal troubles, that could lead to potentially losing your job, hurting your relationships with your family, and things like that. Now, when we're talking about substance use disorders, we are talking about psychoactive drugs. When we're talking about a psychoactive drug, we are talking about something that alters your perception and your mood because it actually reaches the brain. Now, not all drugs that you take are small enough to actually reach your brain. So for example, how many of you have taken aspirin or ibuprofen recently? That is not a psychoactive drug. It does not actually affect your brain. It largely affects pain in your peripheral nervous system. So it affects the things like pain in your lower body and your organs, but it doesn't actually reach the brain. It's not going to modify your perception or your mood per se. On the other hand, what sort of things do alter your perception and your mood? Who here's got some coffee? Caffeine will do that. So caffeine is technically a psychoactive drug. Nicotine is a psychoactive drug. Alcohol is a psychoactive drug. Marijuana is a psychoactive drug. So all of these cross the blood-brain barrier. They actually make contact with the brain. And when they do, they can alter your mood, your perception, and potentially your behavior as well. So we're not talking about all drugs. We're just talking about drugs that are small enough to actually reach the brain. So when we talk about addiction, how does addiction happen? Now, let's be clear. Addiction does not happen with certain types of drugs. So right now in drugs and behavior, we're actually talking about inhalants. So like people that sniff markers or sniff glue or things like that. Those, surprisingly enough, are not actually very addictive. Here's another example. Caffeine is not really addictive. Now, I know for some of you that really love your coffee, that might be surprising. You're like, but I can't function without coffee. Well, so here's the thing. The worst withdrawal symptom that you will ever get from caffeine is a headache. You might feel a little sluggish, you might have a headache, but that's about it. Here's the other thing. Most types of addiction are often going to cause financial harm, legal harm, or things like that, or physical harm. Generally speaking, the worst thing that caffeine does, as long as you're not taking too high of a dose, is temporarily raise your heart rate and your blood pressure and potentially hurt your ability to get a good night's sleep. That's the worst that's going to happen. It's not going to give you lung cancer like smoking might, like nicotine does. Additionally, it's not potentially going to put you into legal trouble or financial trouble if you try to get it. I've never heard of somebody holding up and mugging someone in an alley for money to go get coffee. I've never heard of that. So, but you can have a dependence on caffeine. So one of the things that we find is that you can develop what is called tolerance. And this is really what's critical for addiction. Tolerance is basically the fact that you take drugs for certain types of benefits. Most of us take caffeine, for example, because it gives us a little bit of perky energy. It helps energize us. What happens is the more caffeine that you have, the less benefits you get. You get a diminishing effect of the same dose with repeated use. The more that you take it, the less of the effects you feel. Folks, there was a time when I drank so much caffeine that I could fall asleep after having a Mountain Dew and have a pretty good night's sleep. That is tolerance. How many of you are basically at that point where you can sleep on caffeine? Odds are pretty good you might have a caffeine tolerance. Now, here's what's cool about caffeine. If you stop taking it for a while, that tolerance will reverse itself. So I don't really drink that much caffeine. And if I have caffeine too close to bed, I get the worst night's sleep ever. I toss and turn, I get up a lot, and I don't really feel refreshed in the morning. So tolerance is when, so basically with the same dose, what we find is that with that same dose over time, we don't get as much of the effect that we want. So we're gonna take more. Now, here's what's really critical. Your brain and your body is still being affected by these drugs, even with that tolerance. Now, this tolerance is happening for a couple of different reasons. First of all, your body becomes better at metabolizing and breaking down drugs. Your body gets better at it, so you feel less of the effects. Additionally, different types of receptors for neurotransmitters, because folks, drugs don't work by magic. Drugs work on neurotransmitters, or they look like neurotransmitters. So drugs don't work by magic, they work through neurotransmitters. And what we're gonna find is that if you take a lot of a drug, your body and your brain are going to reduce the number of receptors for that drug, meaning that you're going to feel less of the effects. So we have a lot of opioid receptors in our body. And if you take things like OxyContin or fentanyl repeatedly, your body is basically going to reduce those opioid receptors so that you feel less of the effect. But your brain and body are still affected by these drugs. So you're going to take more to get the same effect that you had in the beginning. So after a repeated exposure, you're going to need more of the drug to produce the same effect. And that can be especially scary for things like opioids or alcohol, because that can lead to overdosing very, very quickly. And repeated use is going to develop and lead to a dependence where you basically are relying on this drug to get you through. Now, some drugs like alcohol and opioids have a really strong physical dependence. If you stop taking the drug after you've taken it for a while, you're going to get some really bad withdrawal symptoms that can potentially kill you. Don't quit alcohol cold turkey. Don't quit heroin cold turkey. Go talk to a doctor, go to a clinic so that you can detoxify safely and basically get through withdrawal safely, because withdrawal from those drugs can kill you. On the other hand, withdrawal from things like stimulants, whether that is cocaine, amphetamines, meth, or even caffeine, they're not going to be fun, but they're also not going to kill you. But we do have this dependency, and it can be physical in nature, or it can be psychological, where we feel like we need to take this drug to cope. So there are different types of drugs. So we have things that are called depressants. Depressants, by and large, depress the nervous system. They inhibit the nervous system. They slow your body down. So that includes things like alcohol, that includes things like opioids, Sometimes that includes things like inhalants. And while you're writing this down, you can have a laugh at my expense. Last week in Drugs and Behavior, we were talking about hallucinogens, and I was looking up information. Now, all of a sudden, I'm getting a lot of emails to my Kadi email about academic papers about magic mushrooms and LSD. And I'm like, why are you sending me this? What kind of person do you think I am? It was kind of funny. I'm like, I was just looking for the altered states of consciousness scale. That's all I wanted. So we have depressants. They kind of slow us down. These are the ones you have to watch out for, especially alcohol and opioids. They are designed to slow your system down. And if you take too much of them, what typically will happen is that you can overdose, because not only does this depress your brain and inhibit the functioning of your brain, it inhibits your respiratory system. You won't be able to breathe. And a lot of people that overdose because of alcohol or because of opioids, what's often happening is that their respiratory system is so depressed and inhibited that they can't breathe. So here's something kind of interesting. I don't know if you're aware of this, but heroin actually started as a cough syrup that was manufactured over the counter by the Bayer Corporation back in the early 1900s. And they ended up finally pulling it because they were even recommending giving this as cough medicine to children and infants. And if you give too much, there's a very thin line between what is a safe dose and what is a dose that will actually stop your breathing. And that's what actually happened. Having said that, though, opioids are really good cough medications because they open up respiratory passageways, which is why you will sometimes see a cough syrup that contains codeine, but you're going to have to get that by prescription because nobody really wants you to have opioids. It's not safe. It's a very thin line between a safe dose and a lethal dose. I actually went to the pharmacy yesterday and saw that Walmart is no longer giving out, no longer prescribing or handing out cough syrup that has codeine. And I actually thought that was pretty interesting. So then we have our stimulants. So our depressants kind of slow us down. Our stimulants are going to give us a lot of energy. So that's going to include caffeine. That's going to include cocaine. That is going to include our amphetamines and our methamphetamine. And then we have our hallucinogens. Now, if I am not mistaken, I think your book lumps marijuana into hallucinogens. If you're hallucinating on marijuana, something isn't right. Not that I want to be clear, the worst drug I've ever tried is alcohol. The only drugs I've ever tried are alcohol and caffeine, but even I know if you're hallucinating on marijuana, something is wrong. We have our hallucinogens. This will include things like magic mushrooms, LSD, and things like that. Marijuana is technically considered a cannabinoid because its technical name is cannabis. But I like saying the word cannabinoid. And it turns out, you know how I mentioned at the beginning of the semester that your body makes its own endorphins? Turns out you make your own cannabinoids as well, and we call those endocannabinoids. Try again.
Nicotine falls where?
Nicotine's a stimulant. Sorry, my bad. I didn't mention that. Yeah, nicotine is a stimulant for sure.
That's what I thought. I'm like,
well, no, you're not. So here's something kind of interesting, and this kind of relates to the notion of tolerance that we've been talking about. So if I take somebody like myself, like a non-smoker or any non-smoker here, and I give you nicotine, you are going to be really edgy and agitated and just very highly stimulated. For somebody who is basically has a dependence on nicotine, giving them nicotine actually calms them down. So it's kind of like what we find when you give something like Ritalin which is actually a stimulant, by the way. When you give somebody with ADHD Ritalin, if you give most of us Ritalin that don't have ADHD, you might actually find that you become very overstimulated. But somebody who has ADHD and they're given something like Ritalin, it actually kind of calms them down and helps them focus and helps their attention kind of slow down. Okay, so depressants are drugs that calm neural activity and they slow body function. Oh, I need to quit for a minute because I spelled this wrong. In Cognitive Psych on Wednesday, we were talking about different mispronunciations, and I have to try really hard not to mispronounce barbiturates because I want to call them barbiturates, and that is not correct. So we have alcohol, that is clearly a depressant. We have opiates, that includes things like OxyContin, that includes things like Vicodin, that includes things like heroin, that includes things like morphine. All of those are designed to calm neural activity and slow body function. And then we have our barbiturates. Those are going to typically be used for anti-anxiety medication, hypnotics, anticonvulsants. So that'll include things like amobarbitol, phenobarbital, which is one you've potentially heard of, and things like that. And then one that I don't have here that is also technically a depressant. How many of you have heard of stuff called benzodiazepines? Benzodiazepines include drugs like Xanax, which is designed to basically be an anti-anxiety medication. And they are typically less dangerous than barbiturates, but they're still pretty dangerous. You can get Xanax is really, really habit forming. And in general, I've kind of noticed this. People are very, very careful, not only about prescribing opioids, but also even benzodiazepines at this point, because they can be so habit forming. When I went to Barcelona, I may have mentioned to y'all that I hate flying so much. When I go to Florida, I drive. It's a nice drive and I'm going to be gone for a while. Why not? You know, I get to crash in Alabama and go to a Publix and get food and stuff like that. It's great. I'm not going to get that with flying, and especially with people being extra rude and entitled this year. I don't want to be on a plane, but to go on the international trip, you kind of have to get on a plane. You can't take a steamer across the Atlantic. It would take too long. So I said, can you please give me, I talked to my GP and I'm like, can you please give me some Xanax because I'm afraid to fly on planes. They gave me like a hardcore antihistamine instead. They did not want me having that. And honestly, that's probably for the best. But yeah, I'm like, why can't you just give me what I asked for? I swear I'm not a drug seeker. I just want this for one trip. But they don't want to take any chances. And honestly, I understand. Depressants can really mess with you in a way that, like, and coming off of them can be really dangerous. Okay, so stimulants are drugs that excite neural activity and speed up our body function. So that will include caffeine, nicotine, cocaine. Okay, here's where it's a little technical. I'm going to be technical with you. Ecstasy is actually half stimulant, half hallucinogen. It's actually a mixed stimulant hallucinogen, but it does have a lot of stimulating properties. And then we also, of course, have methamphetamine and amphetamines. That includes things like speed and pseudoephedrine, which is in sinus and cold medication. Oh, hey, here's another thing. If you ever take a look at your cough syrup or your cough medicine or your cold medicine, check to see if it has something called dextromethorphan in it. That is technically an opioid. But yeah, all of these are stimulants. So here's what's interesting. These are less dangerous in some ways than the depressants are, because if you overdose on these, you're generally not going to feel very good. You are obviously going to have things like high heart rate, your blood pressure could spike, and especially with things like cocaine and heavy use of amphetamines, you could potentially have a stroke or a heart attack. But you get less of a physical dependence on these drugs, and withdrawal is less dangerous, because withdrawal often tends to be the opposite effects of the drug. So a depressant that calms you down is going to basically cause your body to speed up during withdrawal. That can be really dangerous because your heart rate is going to go up, and that could potentially lead to stroke or heart attack. On the other hand, withdrawal from stimulants, you're going to feel like you have the flu, and that's not fun, but it's also probably not lethal. Okay, everybody good? Okay, take your time. And feel free to ask me any questions. Like I said, I teach a whole semester on this. It is really weird to teach that class. When I taught about cannabinoids, I actually had a quiz question and that involved the answer bong. And I felt really weird. I'm like, are we sure this is an academic class? It is. I actually do talk about the neurotransmitters and the brain areas that it works on for sure. Okay. Hallucinogens, these are generally not very addictive. You don't really get withdrawal from these, which is why you're starting to see a lot of people experiment with therapeutic treatments and microdosing. They will distort your perception, and even marijuana can do this. One of the biggest things that marijuana does, one of the most reliable things, it increases your appetite. So if you've heard about the munchies, that's why it happens. It is a reliable, it reliably enhances appetite, which is part of the reason why it's often prescribed for cancer patients who are going through things like chemo or radiation therapy. Their body is trying to fight this cancer, and you are basically suppressing their immune system to basically destroy that cancer as well. But what they need to be doing to help fight is eat and give their body energy. But if you've heard about what chemo can do to you, the last thing you're going to want to do is eat. So marijuana can be provided to help stimulate your appetite and help you eat food. So we also, with things like LSD and mushrooms, we can get sensations with no input, which are known as hallucinations. Ecstasy, because it is a mixed stimulant and hallucinogen, can actually do this as well. And again, if you're getting hallucinations with marijuana, you're probably not using marijuana. One thing we do know with marijuana, though, is that it does modify your sense of time, which could be a distortion of perception, of course, but it's not a true hallucination. So we have LSD and things like mushrooms. And DMT, for those who are curious, which your body actually makes as well. Okay. So with substance use disorders, those are things that oftentimes therapy or detoxification, or in the case of something like opioid abuse, maintenance methods are going to be kind of critical to help manage withdrawal symptoms and manage cravings. But they are considered psychological disorders. And as I said, since I teach the class, if you have any questions on drugs, I can help answer them. But now we're going to move on to something that many of you have probably had some experience with. Either you have experienced this, or a friend or a family member has. We're going to talk about mood disorders for the rest of class today. So when we talk about mood disorders, these are disorders that are going to be characterized by emotional extremes. And in particular, there are a lot of other mood disorders out there. So for example, has anybody kind of had a hard time adjusting since the time change? So some people occasionally struggle with what's called seasonal affective disorder. So when the sun starts going down earlier in the day and the days get colder, some people do experience a little bit of seasonal depression. They tend to do less, they feel kind of a dip in their mood, and they also crave a lot of carbs. We're also going to get a change in sleeping behaviors potentially and eating behaviors. So there are other types of mood disorders out there, but we're going to talk about two major ones. Major depression or unipolar depression or clinical depression. This is when you have an extended period of low mood. And then bipolar disorder. These are periods of depression that alternate with periods of mania. And we will talk about this. Mania is not just being happy. Mania is very, very different. So major depressive disorder, you might be surprised by this with its clinical criteria. It is actually 2 or more weeks. So you only have to be feeling this way for at least 2 weeks. So now that you know that, some of you might be looking back on some rough periods and be like, I could have been depressed and I may not have even realized it. But we have 2 or more weeks of the following. And obviously, I'm not listing all of the different criteria here, but typically we're going to see things like depressed mood, feeling worthless, possibly suicidal ideation, sleeping too much or sleeping too little, eating too much or eating too little, and generally having less interest or pleasure in activities that you like to do. So here's what I mean by that. There are some of you that do not like schoolwork or coming to class. So maybe if you're not really coming to class, that wouldn't necessarily qualify you as being depressed. If, however, you really love art club and you stop going to art club because you're not finding joy in it, that's when you need to be concerned. It's when you lose interest in the things that you love to do or the things that you enjoy doing that it becomes a problem. Now, here's what's really critical. This can't be due to some kind of medical condition. So, for example, low mood that somebody experiences during Alzheimer's disease may not be depression. It may be due to the brain changes that occur with Alzheimer's. And it can't be due to drugs either, because drugs can make you feel kind of depressed, especially when you come down from them. So we have to make sure that this is something that was already pre-existing besides medical conditions and drugs. And for most people here in the United States, it is the biggest reason for seeking mental health services. So here's what's interesting. Anxiety is the most common disorder that people are diagnosed with. But it's not the #1 reason for seeking mental health services. And I think part of the reason for that is that with anxiety, you've still got energy. You've got a lot of nervous energy, anxious energy, but you've still got the energy to do things. Anxiety is distressing, but it has a little more fight than depression does. Depression, you have no energy, and that's way more concerning for a lot of people, and I understand that. Now, here's something you may not know. Most depression does eventually get better on its own. However, seeking help, whether that is therapy, talking to a counselor, potentially getting medication or other types of treatment, can help speed that process along. And additionally, therapy and counseling can give you the tools and the skills that you need to fight these things and to help manage these things, because a lot of people who struggle with depression, so my sister is one of those people, and it kind of comes in waves for her. It's not just one and done. Now, for some of you, it's going to be one and done. But for some of you, it might come back in different periods. And if you have the skills to manage it, That's really, really beneficial. So this is me kind of telling you that if you're struggling with something like this, don't wait to seek help. I know it's hard to seek help, and I'm a huge hypocrite because, folks, when I was seeking help for my panic attacks, I remember all of the times that I tell you all and students like you, go get help. There's no shame in it. There's nothing wrong with taking medication for it either if it helps you. And yet here I am seeking therapy going, I clearly wasn't tough enough to manage this. No, you are tough, but you'll be even tougher with those skills, with somebody that you can talk to. You are tough because you're going through this, but be kind to yourself. You deserve that much. Like, you're awesome, and you need those skills to help you continue to be awesome. Don't write this down, but I think one of the for somebody like me who's been fortunate enough to never really struggle with depression, like I said, I got all this nervous energy all the time. It can be really easy. You don't need to write this down. So it can be really easy to think of depression as just feeling bad. And it's really not. It's about feeling numb. It is about feeling numb. So this comes from Ali Broche. She is a webcomic creator. She has a webcomic called Hyperbole and a Half, and she was really open. She's the one who did Clean All the Things. She's that person. But she was really open about her depression and the way that people treated her with depression. And I want to just kind of read this to you because I think it is a really spot on characterization for what depression is. And if you've never experienced it, I think it does a good job of explaining it. At first, I try to explain that it's not really negativity or sadness anymore. It's more just this detached, meaningless fog where you can't feel anything about anything, even the things you love, even fun things. And you're horribly bored and lonely, but since you've lost your ability to connect with any of the things that would normally make you less bored and lonely, you're stuck in the boring, lonely, meaningless void without anything to distract you from how boring, lonely, and meaningless it is. And I think that's a really good characterization of the numbing power that depression can have when you're struggling with it. It's not just about feeling bad. And one of the other things that she mentions is that the way that we try to talk to people who have depression, we don't know how to talk about mental health. We're more open about it than we used to be, but we still don't know how to talk about it. How many of you know somebody in your life or you yourself have struggled with depression and somebody has told you or your friends something incredibly unhelpful? Things like cheer up, just go for a run, get some exercise, get outside. And let's be clear, you should be doing exercise. You should be going outside, but that should be an end in itself. It shouldn't be a means to an end. And just as a reminder, you can do everything right and still be struggling with these things. What we need is to say to people, I'm here for you, and actually try to reach out and not gloss over what they're feeling just because it makes us uncomfortable or because we don't understand. Ali Broche kind of likens this to fish being dead. That depression is basically your pet fish being dead, and people come up to you and go, have you tried making sure that the fish aren't dead? That's what telling somebody to cheer up with depression is like. Believe me, if they wanted to feel better, they would. But this is something much bigger and much more difficult to grapple with. Smiling is not going to fix that. A walk outside may not fix that. Getting regular exercise may not fix that. So now we got to talk about bipolar disorder. So bipolar disorder is when you have periods that alternate between depressive episodes and periods of mania. And I just want to get this out of the way. Mania does not look like me, for example. I am not in a manic episode. I have a lot of happy energy. People that have mania are way, way elevated in terms of their mood. They are overexcited. They are often very impulsive. They can go for days without sleep. They talk really fast. Their thoughts are disorganized and racing, and they can be incredibly edgy and irritable. And for some people with manic episodes, they might actually have psychotic features, including delusions. So mania is not just about being happy. It's not about being bouncy. It's having abnormally elevated energy. Like during a manic episode, people that struggle with bipolar will have these whims. I learned about this in my abnormal psych class that I TA'd for. The instructor told us a story of one of her friends who was struggling with bipolar, and just out of nowhere during a manic episode, she decided that she was going to sell jewelry that was made out of little beads that were carved from vegetables and then shellacked. And then during her manic episode, she spent an entire night just making and carving these intricate beads and shellacking them. And she did all of that in the span of one night with no sleep. That's what we're kind of talking about here. So racing thoughts, impulsivity. People might engage in things like gambling, promiscuous sex, making ridiculous high cost purchases, impulsive shopping, things like that. Now, here's what's interesting. With mood disorders like depression and with anxiety disorders, what we tend to find is that women report these more often than men. Here's what's really interesting about bipolar. It is equally common in men and in women. And I can't go into the full details of why this is, but when you see something that is equally common between men and women, it has a really strong genetic link. It is less due to socialization and it's more due to genetics. Schizophrenia is similar. So this is equally common in men and women. And then additionally, we have what is called bipolar type 1 and bipolar type 2. Bipolar type 1 is the more severe version. The manic episodes are massive. With bipolar type 2, the manic episodes are not as big. And some people with bipolar type 2 actually really dislike that. They don't get any of the benefit of those manic episodes. They don't really get the energy or the euphoria during those manic episodes. It's much, much lower. One thing that I will mention is that people with bipolar disorder find their manic episodes to be great. There are periods of very high productivity, elevated mood. And so especially for those that are taking medication, getting them to stay on that medication is critical because most medication for bipolar disorder, here's something kind of interesting. Researchers believe that part of the reason that the depressive episodes are as bad as they are in bipolar is partially due to coming out of that manic episode. So some people believe that if you can lower the mania, you will also lessen the severity of the depression that comes after. So a lot of the medication is designed to bring down those manic episodes, and people really like their manic episodes. They get a lot of work done. They feel good. And so because of that, getting them to stay on medication is critical. Bless you. I'm going to go ahead and stop here. We will talk more about the cycle of depression, and we will finish up on Monday before our exam talking about schizophrenia. Expect an email from me over the weekend or by Monday to a link of a review session that I've recorded just for you for the 4th exam, and I will do the same for the final. So you don't even have to show up. I'll record it for you on my own. You can ask me questions after though, of course. All right, have a good weekend, everybody.